No, not that one. What is it? United?
United.
Is that there's one that's just like so garish that it just gives me a headache to even look at it. No, that's not the one I was thinking of either.
Southwest.
The Southwest is.
No, Southwest is probably one of the nicest.
United's changed recently.
Okay, so that
Even a month ago, it wasn't like that.
Yeah, I would say
They were
that
Mhm.
Southwest is probably one of the nicest designed airline sites on the web. Not that it's perfect, it's just better than all of its competitors. Anyway, yeah, I think it was United, but it looks like they changed their site. Anyway, all that to say that like grids create continuous groups of content. It creates what is called closure, where some content is together and some of it is apart. It allows you to have white space, which indicates what's important and what's not hierarchically. So grids are really useful for non-designers to use because it allows you to put some elements on the page in a more or less aesthetically appealing way without having to think very deeply about the design. Why? Again, this is something that I didn't say, but these are great questions that you could have asked me. It's like, why does it have 12 columns? We talked a little bit about that, but there's more than one reason for that.
Is it the golden mean?
Yeah, so I kind of brought that up, and then did anybody actually understand the gibberish that I said about the golden ratio yesterday?
The 1 media page is massive.
Yeah.
It's fine. It's supposed to be, it's like a naturally occurring ratio that's just really supposed to be pleasing to, like, everybody
Right.
design.
It's
supposed
not
to God created the golden ratio.
designer, the golden ratio is a bunch of crap.
But, well, you know,
1.6.
to each his own, I guess. But, a simplification of the golden ratio is just the rule of thirds, which again, this is a composition photograph of where you can see, I can actually tell what the details of that are, but, let's go to this one. Right, we're composing photographs using the rule of thirds, where like the weight or gravity of the photograph is on this side, this 2/3 of the thing, and then also this 2/3 of the photograph. So there's a lot. That's a simplification of the golden ratio because the golden ratio is like 1.62, not one. Anyway, I can't remember. But the idea is like grids allow you to put heavy and light-looking things next to each other in easy-to-use ways. So most grids, actually all grids that I know of, are divisible by 3, so that you can do thirds. So like it's very common to have, for instance, a sidebar that is exactly half of the content, so that you have that being 1/3 and this being 2/3 of the document. I bet if I measured this, it would be exactly 1/3 of the whole thing. So that's like 952, and then the sidebar is going to be 302, which
30 bucks.
2, yeah, it's about 1/3. So that's the other big thing about grids, is that it allows you to have the ratios of content just sort of out of the box without having to think too deeply about it. Anyway, this isn't supposed to be a lecture on like design principles, but more about like you need to be asking more questions, right? If there's ever anything you may not know or care about aesthetically appealing designs, but if there's ever anything that's ambiguous, like why are we using neat, or what does it give us, that's definitely like something that is a class stopper. If you don't understand, because I never gave you those two things, if we started using neat, if you didn't understand that it lines up elements and makes responsive web development easier, then it's your job to like sort of stop me and say, hey, I don't understand why we're doing this. And that's a perfect, because I guarantee you that if you're thinking that, there's at least one other person in the room who has no idea what I'm talking about. So, anyway, so what, any other notes on neat specifically?
Kind of convenient audible line, like vertical.
Yeah, a quicker way to
Just make sure everything lines up instead of national area percentages and, well, I think this one's that, this one's that.
Yeah. What about actually using it? Did anybody write down how to use it at all?
It uses lots of margins.
Okay, yeah, it does
So,
use margins, but I mean, like, actually, like, in your code, how would you go about implementing something with Meet?
Wait, say that again?
Yeah, like, how would you actually, like, implement a grid layout with Meet?
You gotta start the, you mean like code-wise, or just like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with, like, in actual code.
You gotta,
Install burden.
yeah, you gotta install Burton and it's either your project folder and import it.
Okay, so here's another thing that this is talking about, like, what you should be writing down in class is like, how do I actually implement something using this? If you ever like finish a lecture and then you think that you understand the concepts and then you go to sit down to actually do the project, but you're having trouble thinking through the steps, I'm sure this has never happened to anybody. That happens all the time, right? That's a really common thing, is that if you have like a perceived fluency during class where you're like, oh, I get this, like columns and containers, and then you actually sit down at 12 o'clock and you're like, I have no idea what I'm doing. One way to remedy that is during the lecture, your takeaway for anything that we introduce is like, how can I practically apply this concept to the project that I have tonight? So I always try to, sometimes I fail to, but I always try to at least give you a glimpse of what that evening's homework is, so that you can sort of be asking yourself the question, how do I apply what I'm learning right now in a very direct and practical way to what I have in front of me? So one thing that I really encourage you to start doing, if you're not doing it during class, is to take notes on like next steps. And not next steps. So the next steps for Bourbon and Neat, or for Neat specifically, is to install both Bourbon and Neat. You don't have to write down how to do that, because you know, or should know, that that's just written out for you in the notes already, in my notes. So you don't necessarily need to know what the commands are, because you can just look those up. But you should know that your first step is to install Bourbon and Neat, and then probably that, and this, I can't tell you, and this needs to be done for each project. And so that was sort of the key takeaway of that part of that discussion yesterday, was not the actual commands, because those are sort of executable, but just that you have to install both of them, they depend on each other. Well, Neat depends on Bourbon, and that it needs to be done for each project. So then, in using Neat, what is the next step after installing Bourbon and Neat's the libraries?
Import testing.
Okay, so then import in SCSS file. Next. In what way?
You have to decide what columns
Absolutely.
you're going to use and outside of
Start with like HTML structure, I guess.
Yeah, not necessarily the HTML structure, but, well, sort of, actually, sort of. But with Neat, and again, I may or may not have done actually a good job of explaining this yesterday, but Neat is all about columns. When you hear the word grid, I kind of forget. Again, remember, you can stop me and ask me about any terminology I'm ever using. When most people think of a grid, they think of this. That is not what grid means to designers and developers. Okay, like, sorry, it's a different word. So if you were confused about that, the grid does not mean anything about rows and columns of squares right next to each other with like lines or whatever. When a designer or developer hears a grid, they think of, well, I guess this is the closest example. Right, so they think of columns with space or no space in between the columns. Is there a better example vision in my head when somebody says the word grid in the context of web development. Right? It's a bunch of columns with spaces between them, and then different boxes lined up on those columns with spacing between the boxes corresponding to spacing between the columns. What's that?
Determine grid layout.
Yes, exactly. So the first thing, or the next thing that you would do is determine, well, how many columns do you need, which, again, most of the time, it's just going to be 12. That's usually pretty good, because that's divisible by both 4 and 3, which are the most common number of things that are next to each other, if that makes sense. As well as allowing you to do rule of thirds things, like having, this is so small, but I'm just going to make it all grainy, that's cool. So in addition to allowing things, 4 things next to each other or 3 things next to each other, it allows you to follow the rule of thirds, which again, designers might yell at you for this, but it's an easy go-to, which is to have like 2/3 of the, although this is actually more than 2/3. This is 3/4. But it could allow you to do the rule of thirds layout, where the main content takes up 2/3 of the space, and then the ancillary or supplemental content takes up 1/3 of the space. So you have to think about how many columns you want, and then figure out how you're going to lay things out on those columns. So the end goal of drawing boxes on the screen is to come up with something a little bit like this. You could actually, that'd be kind of hard. So if you have Photoshop and you know how to use it, Photoshop can, and Sketch as well, which is a UI interface design application, they can overlay grids on top of images for you. But if you just don't want to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars on something you only use a couple times, then you just kind of have to imagine the columns that draw the boxes. That's sort of the end goal, is to determine how many columns you need, and then figure out how to break that up in your wireframes or whatever.
This may sound like a dumb question, but what exactly is a wireframe?
That's not a dumb question at all. So that's a great example. I just used a phrase that is very familiar to me, but that is probably new to many of you. So, let me finish typing this out and I'll answer what a wireframe is. So a wireframe is a term that's used for a lot of different levels of prototyping and application. So some people would call something like this a wireframe, where you use, there's wireframing tools that like just draw boxes and words, or you could actually just use something like Pages, which is like comes with your Mac, I think. To just draw some boxes with stuff in it. So that's a wireframe. It's called a wireframe because of the wireframe prototypes that a lot of engineers would use before they actually build a project. And so because software development sort of evolved from engineering, the term just sort of got carried over. And wireframes would normally be 3-dimensional. You've probably seen them before, where it's like a 3-dimensional shape, but it looks like a mesh is sort of over it. A wire frame around the objects. But because software development evolved from engineering, I guess that's probably where we got that phrase. But it usually just means drawing boxes and words.
So grid layout is underneath the wireframe.
Right, absolutely. Now some people would also call what I've given you so far a wireframe as well. Like some people would refer to this as a wireframe. I would refer to this as a mock-up. But right. But some people would call this a wireframe as well. In fact, a lot of the assignments, like this assignment, I think even referred to this as a wireframe, even though I think that's wrong, but you know, whatever. Yeah, anyway, so you could use Photoshop Overlay Grid, but the core idea is you just want to be able to draw, lay out those boxes on the columns. And I mean, you could, in fact, draw the grid probably yourself using the preview, but it would be a little bit of work. So, and then once you like sort of determine that, how many columns you need to figure out how to lay out the main boxes on the grid, what would like maybe, I mean, we can do that if it would be helpful first, but then what would the next step after that be? Like, what are the main components that we talked about of actually using Meet in your programming work?
Did you go ahead and figure out breakpoints, or is it too early for that?
It's not, this wouldn't be a bad way to do it. You could do breakpoints first. We'll talk actually a little bit about that today, because I encourage you to try doing the weekend's homework mobile first, and see how that goes.
Actually, I have a quick question about that.
Yeah.
Because so for what we've been doing, you've been giving us a desktop layout and then telling us to kind of make it down or push it
Yes.
down mobile. And I find that a lot of the design of it, I have to go back and create divs in order to kind of embed things within each other because the way that the layout works on mobile. Is that kind of fixed if you do the mobile first, or does that make it easier?
You just have different problems if you do the mobile
Okay.
first. Yeah, the key thing that I really like about doing mobile first development is that it allows you to focus on components versus complicated layouts. Because like you would not have to deal with like this section being complicated on mobile. Because it was probably just at first. So it allows you to make momentum towards your goal without having to deal with stuff that's as complicated. Because like on mobile, almost definitely you would have the 4 pictures in a single column over each other. You would not necessarily, you could have done it a different way, but that's way easier than figuring out how to do this layout with this weird position skateboard stick next to it.
Well, like for example, the bars at the top that are like the nav bars.
Yeah.
You've got your social buttons at the very top, and then you've got your nav bars, and those are 2 different kind of block level elements.
Yeah.
But if you push it down to mobile, and you want to kind of keep feel like a pretty good layout, you keep the social buttons at the right, and then you push the nav bars to the left into the menu. And then you've got the issue of in your HTML, it doesn't lay out that way. It's going to be, you can't really float right and then float left, because they're going to go float and against each other in the middle. And so you have to create a div, and I just wondered if there was issues like that No?
Yeah, I mean, it's never easy.
Okay.
That's what you're asking. There's no way to make it easy.
Okay. I didn't know if there was like, if you said that at some point there's a mantra that always start mobile first.
Some people say that.
Okay.
I don't say that.
Okay.
I say always start with what is going to give the most business value to your client. Because I did freelance for so long that a lot of my clients never needed or wanted mobile sites because their users were like 99% using like Windows laptops or whatever. You know, like nobody was accessing their site from a mobile phone. So my mantra is definitely just do whatever your client is going to make your client the most money. But just a more philosophically designer-oriented mantra would, in fact, be always start mobile first, because then you make sure that it's, the site works well for people on limited devices. Because mobile phones would force you to embrace the constraints of the platform you're developing for. As opposed to like, if you just assume everybody's going to be accessing your site with Chrome on a laptop or a desktop, then you're going to be putting a lot of really big images that are slow loading. You're going to be using maybe some complicated JavaScript later on that does some weird things on mobile. So some people would argue mobile first is always the way to go.
So when you're talking about like JavaScript, like Is Chrome on an iPad the same as Chrome on a desktop other than the size?
No, so Chrome on iOS actually uses the Safari WebKit engine. So it has a lot of the user interface elements that you're used to, but it actually uses the JavaScript engine and the CSS layout engine that Safari do. So if it doesn't work on Safari for iOS, it also will work on Chrome for iOS. That actually, yeah, that's fairly common. Most mobile phone platforms are fairly limited as far as browsers are concerned. Okay, so like once you determine how many columns you need and how to lay out the main boxes on the grid, really you have to, and this is, I guess I'll just tell you, because I don't want to just sit here forever while I wait for somebody to say the right answer. Right, you need to determine what the containers for your grid are going to be. The way that pretty much any grid system works is that you have containers, and inside those containers are the columns of the grid. So to go back to the sort of example I had open earlier, this one, right? What would the containers of the grid be? Both of those things are right. So Holly basically said the header and the footer would be containers, and then you kind of said this part would be containers. Is that what you're saying?
Side, as a side.
Yeah. Whereas I think like Richard was basically like, you just do the body.
Well, I'm going to say body, but just the main content is.
So I guess what I'll say is like in this case, this whole thing is the container of the grid. So like everything inside of the body is on the 12-column grid. In a layout like that, then you only need one outer container because literally everything inside of it is going to be on the 12-column grid. However, in a layout like if I closed it, this, not everything is necessarily on the grid. Right? So I would probably make either one outer container and then everything in here, for the most part, is on a 12-column grid. The skateboards are sort of an exception, but I might think of a better way to talk about this as we go along. But whereas this part and this part really don't seem to be on a 12-column grid to me. So you could do that. The other option that you have is actually make a bunch of containers only for the things that need columns. So this right here would be an outer container. This, if you're doing it that way, could just be a div because it's a block level element. So you wouldn't even need to worry about using neat for this section.
Wouldn't it be better to use neat though for easier mobile response?
Not necessarily, not if it's always a block level element that's full width. In that case, it's always just going to be full width. But then like this is on columns, so you'd want to have a different layout on mobile probably. Again, this is on columns. So you could just do like a bunch of outer containers as well. There's not really a right way, other than that you just have to know that if you put something inside of an outer container, the direct children of that outer container should be on the grid using span columns. So like, even though like this skateboard part is not, I probably wouldn't use the grid for the actual skateboards because the actual white box would be a child of the container. I would need to at least use span columns on the white box. But then inside of it, right, it's on an element by element basis. So once I'm inside that box though, I can still use the grid, but I don't have to. So like I could just say that this white box is span columns 12, and then I'm done. And then I just use inline block on the skateboards and it just works.
I completely missed that.
Yeah.
I mean that's not obvious. So you didn't necessarily
That's
miss
like,
anything.
I feel like it's a little awkward.
So while hopefully the idea is that Neat makes it easier, not harder, to do CSS. If you found this project to be harder than Surf and Paddle, then there's like a missing link somewhere, right? Because Surf and Paddle is a pain in the ass. I mean, let's be honest. It is meant to be that way. It's purposely meant to force you to use a bunch of fiddly CSS properties. But this project can be done really quickly, at least the main layout of it can be done really quickly, if you understand what grids are for and how to use them, which you may or may not have known.
And how you know.
Right. So then really the step for implementing Neat is use outer container on elements that need internal columns. Use span columns on elements that need to span some or all of the columns of the grid. And then finally use omega on the last element in each grid row.
Omega is only for if you have more than one row, right?
Yeah, because last child is already taken care of. I put a semicolon because this is, I forgot that English is not JavaScript. Last child is already taken care of, so if I were to put this stuff in, this stuff inside of a grid, and this last element right here is the last child in that container, so it'll automatically have omega on it, so it won't have a margin right. But this element and this element will not, so I have to automatically add omega to those. So only the last child of the container has omega, which just means no margin right. Omega was chosen because, if you know Greek, omega being the last letter of the Greek alphabet, it's like meant to indicate the last element of the row. I think that's why they chose it, at least.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Can you go back to the note statement thing?
Yeah, so the idea for me to do this is not just to review Neat, but also to give you some hints about what your notes might look like, right? You should have a general idea of all new projects of like what can you actually do to take this and use it in your project. And if you don't have this by the end of the class, then it's a good way of asking questions like, hey, we just spent 3 hours talking about something, but I still don't know how to use it. So it's definitely, it can be a good guideline for you to know how to ask the right questions so that you don't feel so abandoned during the lab. Not every lecture is going to be about practically applying things. Some of them are going to be more conceptual. But part of our methodology at the Iron Yard is to give you more hands-on experience rather than the book learning. Because you can learn all that stuff on your own for free, on just reading the documentation on Mozilla. There are people who just like memorize the Mozilla Developer Network documentation. I sort of think about those people the same way that sort of analogous to the people who just memorize dictionary definitions. It's just, I couldn't do it. It's too boring. Although I guess Malcolm X, who if you haven't seen my new poster in my office, Malcolm X actually, when he was in prison, memorized the dictionary. So, there you go.
He had more than 12 years.